I traveled from Washington, D.C. to Chicago, where Nnedi lives. Nnedi is a Nigerian-American author of Africanfuturism, a subcategory of science fiction that uses the diverse continent of Africa as inspiration for settings, characters, and stories. But her writing defies easy categorization. I met Nnedi in the suburbs of Chicago, near where she grew up. How about the different genres? Do you set out saying, I'm going to write a novel, or I'm going to write this, or I'm going to write that? Because you are kind of all over the place.
All over the
right?
place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm all over the place. And it's, yeah, I don't set out. I just start writing the story that comes to me. And I don't pay attention to genre at all. Like, I don't think, okay, this is going to be a science fiction story, so let me make it a science fiction story or a fantasy or whatever. I don't even think about whether it's going to be young adult or adult. The only time I've thought about it is for comics, because comics is a very definite structure, or a children's picture book. That's a very definite structure. But young adult, middle grade, adult, I don't think about that as I'm writing it. I just write it, and then whatever it is what it is. And I've always been like that. I mean, like, even when I was, before I was a writer, I would come through the library because I loved reading books. That was a big hint that I'd be doing what I'm doing now. But whenever I would come through the library, I wouldn't look at the categories. You know, even this library in particular, this is where I really started. I remember doing that. They have the adult section and then the children's section. And this library was rebuilt, and in the old version, they were all on the same floor. And so I would just, at some point I migrated into the adult section, and I didn't even know. I would just pick up, but like, if it looked interesting, I would read it. So that's how I've always been, and so that's how I write as well. If that's what the story requires, that's what it will be. So because of that, a lot of my novels and just stories as a whole are hard to categorize, because I don't care about categories. I care about the story.
Some of Nnedi's books are being adapted for television. Her 2010 novel, Who Fears Death, about a girl with superpowers, is becoming an HBO series co-produced by Game of Thrones creator George R.R. Martin. And Hulu is ordering a pilot of Nnedi's Binti series about a girl who attends an interstellar university. She's also written a spin-off from the popular Marvel Black Panther comic series. Her work has garnered the genre's top honors, including the Hugo, Nebula, and World Fantasy Awards. Growing up, Nnedi loved science and wanted to be an entomologist. She was also a star tennis player, but a personal tragedy changed her plans. I suppose all of us have turning points in our life, and yours came at a young age, and it really kind of changed the whole trajectory of your life in many respects. If you don't mind talking about it, I mean, what happened and how was that period in your life?
Yeah, it's interesting the way that I came to writing, because I didn't start writing until I was 19 years old, and that was when just a really it was rather traumatic event happened in my life, which was, but I have to back up before I can get to that. So from the age of 9, I was playing semi-pro tennis, and my sisters as well. We were all really good, just naturally really good at this sport. My parents loved tennis, so they put us in that, and we just turned out to really take to it. Around the age of 13, I was diagnosed with scoliosis, and scoliosis is just the curvature of the spine. It's very common. Lots of people have scoliosis, but mine was really severe. My scoliosis was getting worse and worse because of gravity, and the doctors were like, okay, this is getting really severe. So I was on the tennis team at University of Illinois in my freshman year, and that was when they took an x-ray of my spine, and they were like, okay, you're not having any pain or discomfort or anything, but your curvature is so bad that if you don't have this surgery to correct it, you're going to be crippled by the time you're 25. They're like, okay, you know, you have the surgery, you'll be back on the tennis court in a few weeks. There is a risk because you're straightening out the spine and fusing some of the vertebrae, and we're dealing with the spinal cord, so there's always a risk with that. So it's 1% though, 1% chance of paralysis with that. Otherwise, you know, versus 100% of being crippled. So it was clear that I should have the surgery. So I went, had the surgery after my freshman year in college that May, and I woke up 9 hours later from the surgery, paralyzed from the waist down. And so like when I was in that hospital bed in those first few days, when they're like, you know, we don't know if you're gonna walk again, I knew there was a moment where I'm like, either I'm gonna lose my mind or there's something I gotta find something. I just picked up a pen and just started writing a story that came into my mind. And the story involved a woman who could fly. You know, and when you look back, it's pretty clear psychologically, a woman who can fly doesn't need to walk. So I'm writing this story, and there was something about the act of writing that story and like going into it, not running away. It wasn't escapism. It was like going into it. And there was something that just pulled me out of the dark place. And that was a moment when I started writing. Really, if you have to look at a specific time, it was that moment that was where it all began. Because from that moment on, you know, I haven't stopped writing since.
Nnedi's writing weaves together African-inspired places, cultures, and characters. Her parents are immigrants from Nigeria. Although she was born in the United States, Nnedi's connection to her family's homeland was always strong. You're a child of immigrants, and you have that connection to Nigeria, and I think that feeds a lot of your writing too, in a way, doesn't it? Talk to us about that.
Oh yeah, very much so, actually. It feeds my writing so much that I consider Nigeria to be my muse, because like a lot of the core of a lot of the stories that I've written, actually all of them, come from just God, it's hard to articulate because, okay, so I'm the child of immigrants, right? And my parents came here in 1969 and they came for school, and they ended up staying because of the civil war that had broken out in Nigeria at the time. And so that's how I ended up being born here. As soon as the war was over, my parents were the type of immigrants who they wanted to stay connected to their family back home. That was really important, and it's not just, you know, like calling them up and saying, hey, how are you doing? They wanted to go back, and they wanted their kids to understand what their heritage was and is. And so, like, from a young age, my parents were taking us back to Nigeria, right? And so this was all before I started writing. So those trips, and we would go every year, sometimes twice a year as a family, and we'd go meet our family, our relatives, and we'd stay in the village, we'd stay in the city, and then we'd stay in the village, and these deeply affected my sisters and I, deeply. They were like epic trips with wonderful things and some terrible, it was just epic, and we would talk about them all the time. And so when I finally started writing, it just naturally came through. Like, I knew exactly where I wanted to set my stories. I knew, it was just like, that was where the energy was. Those were the places that we had always been very attached to, where, you know, you had to confront aspects of who you were. All of that was deeply, like, formative for me. You know, it made me understand, because being in the United States, being born and raised in the United States, we had to deal with what that meant, being black children. So we were dealing with a lot of racism in our neighborhood, which was in the south suburbs of Chicago in the 80s. So we were dealing with a lot of racism there. And then in the middle of that, my parents would take us back to Nigeria. So it was like, early on, I got to understand that the world was a big place. The world was a diverse place, and so like we're dealing with America, and then we're dealing with another part of the world where everybody was black and racism didn't exist, and you have this thing called tribalism, and then your people are here, and they look like you, and they speak a different language. It was really, it just broadened everything for us. So, like, early on, I came to kind of fuse this idea of, okay, I'm American, but I know that I'm also Nigerian. I'm very clear on that, but I also know that I'm an American Nigerian, which means there are all these identity politics and issues that go into that. And I've been, you know, grappling with that since I was very young. And so when I sat down to start writing, all of this came forth.
You know, you mentioned racism, and it was almost a throwaway line, and there's a lot more there,
Yeah.
I'm sure. How does that fuel your writing? Because a lot of your writing is about outsiders, which probably is how you must have felt in this environment. And I guess in some ways, some of these things that have happened in your life that have not been all that great have actually helped kind of fuel some of the creativity in your writing, I guess?
Yeah, Yeah, I would definitely say that. Yeah, I mean, I've always existed on a lot of fault lines. That's the way I put it, and that does fuel what I write. Like, you know, we were the one of the first black families to move into our neighborhood in South Holland in the 80s. And the racism we dealt with was very intense. It was like, it was intense. It was daily, it was all the time. But somehow I think because my parents were immigrants and they had this attitude of you move forward regardless. That also moved into this idea of you have fun regardless of the racism. So when I think of my childhood, it was fun. It was rosy, even though we had a lot of things where if I told those stories, it was very problematic, but it was fun. So there was that. You know, and then there's the other side of it where being a Nigerian-American, where, you know, you go home, you deal with the racism here, and then you go home, and then people would make fun of the fact that that you couldn't speak the language because you were born here. When you tried to speak the language, it was you just mutilated, and you were the American Nigerian. So those issues of identity, and then also I was an athlete, but I was also a big reader. So I was like a nerd, but I was an athlete. You know, so all those fault lines, you know, I think that's where this idea of writing about outsiders comes from, because I've always felt like an outsider in multiple important groups in my life, and I don't have a problem with it though. Like I've come through where I understand, you know, I'm very clear on who I am, and I understand that I'm like an outsider, insider. I'm here, but I'm not there, and yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with how I ended up writing even speculative fiction, you know, science fiction and the fantastical stuff. It's all part of it.
And what's interesting to me is every major setback or hurdle that you've had kind of creates who you are, even to the extent that, you know, I don't feel as though I could write like you, but I've certainly felt like I want to write something about the TSA because they drive me crazy, and yet the TSA drives you nuts. And I love the LaGuardia story. So tell that for our viewers.
Oh boy. Okay, so LaGuardia. LaGuardia is, it's so much, but it starts off with a woman who is coming through an intergalactic, it's so hard to explain.
But you have to do it because it's a great story.
God. Okay, so first I'll explain the origin of how I ended up writing about the TSA. So I have a lot of hair, you know, and like my hair, it's all real, it's all mine, and it's long enough to reach the ground. It touches the ground now. And so whenever I fly and you know, go through the TSA, I always wear it wrapped up. Or I've tried wearing it down too. I've tried wearing it in braids, and I've done everything, and it still gets the same reaction. So whenever I go through, there's usually some problem, right? And so and I travel a lot. And there was this one time where I went through, I came through LaGuardia. I was leaving from an event, and it was very thorough. Like the check was very thorough. I went through, and they took me aside, and then I had to do the additional screening, and I had to go in I opted to go in the room with the curtain, and they made me take down my bun. They made me, they went and touched every single one of my locks, because my locks are very thick, and like squeezed it from the tip to the root, all of them. And so they went through all of that. Took a while. I was angry, and then I got through, got my bags, and got through. And when I got home, I got to my car, I opened my bag, and inside my bag it looks like a lipstick case, but it was mace. So they went through and they were looking for weapons in my hair, I guess, but they missed the mace. And so like the metaphor of that is just so powerful to me. And that has happened several times to me. But the first time it happened was in LaGuardia. So I tend to, like, you know, turn lemons into lemonade. And so this really, it's bugged me for many years. And so this eventually gave me this idea for this story about this woman who is coming through LaGuardia. It's in the near future, because I like near future. And this is in a time when aliens are part of our, you know, aliens have immigrated to Earth in various capacities. But so we have a our main character, she's coming from Nigeria, and she gets the same treatment through the TSA. And they check her, and she's interviewed about coming through and that she's Nigerian and all this stuff. And they're focused on that. They're focused on the fact that she's Nigerian and what is she? Is she bringing whatever? What is she bringing through? So she gets interrogated and she gets through. And when she gets into her car, she brings out this bud that turns out to be an alien that she's just smuggled into the country, and they didn't know because they were so busy focusing on her. So that was where that's just the beginning of LaGuardia. There's so much more.
The last couple decades have seen a technological explosion in Africa. For example, the continent is home to at least 600 tech hubs aimed at empowering entrepreneurs and advancing innovation. The largest concentrations are in Kenya and Nigeria.
And it's so interesting because it's a big part of your past, and yet the style of writing, when you write your type of material, it's about the future and it's about spaceships. So it's this blending of past and future, and that gives it kind of a texture you don't find in other type of writing, really, right? I mean,
yeah. It's and I think that a lot of it has to do with just that hybridity within me, that being Nigerian and American and exploring issues of identity, and then like I didn't even start writing science fiction because of like in a normal way. I started writing science fiction because because of those trips to Nigeria. Those trips to my ancestral village, because we would go there, especially as I started getting older, I started noticing more like the politics. I started understanding a lot more of what was happening around me, but also I started noticing technology, and I started noticing it popping up in interesting places whenever we would go to Nigeria, like in the most rural of places where you would think, there's no electricity or running water here, and then you'd see a cell phone, and you'd see just certain things reaching those places, and I found that very interesting. Like for me, being an American Nigerian, when I'd go there, because I wasn't from there, I would notice it. So the people living there, they may have noticed it a little bit, but like my noticing it was far more acute because of that. And the fact that I was Nigerian was why I was there. So like this hybrid kind of point of view really kind of brought that out. So once I started noticing the technology, I started thinking like, oh, wow, if you've got a cell phone, like there's a palm wine tapper with a cell phone in his pocket who's going up the tree and leaning back to talk on his cell phone, what is this place gonna be like in the future? Like what, where you're lacking a certain kind of infrastructure, but it jumps over that lacking to have this even more advanced technology. What is this place going to be like in the future? And so I started thinking about that and realizing that I wanted to read that, and then I couldn't find it. So I decided, okay, well, let me write it so I can read it. So that was really how I arrived at writing science fiction. It wasn't from reading previous things. It was from going to this part of the world and then just seeing technology and then imagining.
H.P. Lovecraft was an American author of science fiction and fantasy. The World Fantasy Award statuette was crafted in his likeness. Nnedi, in 2011, received the award for Who Fears Death. She was the first Black writer to win for a novel since the awards began in 1975. But Lovecraft's legacy is complicated. He was a known anti-Semite and racist. One of his poems describes Black people as beasts and semi-human.
One of the highlights of any career is when you are honored with an award for your work, and you won the coveted World Fantasy Award for Best Novel. And you know where I'm going with this. And you got a statuette, and it's in the likeness of H.P. Lovecraft. And for a kid who grew up dealing with racism, to get this coveted honor, but then to have that statuette, it created kind of an internal conflict in a way. Didn't it? Talk to us about that.
So it took a few weeks for the statuette to arrive, and it arrived, and I was, at first I was very proud of it. I was like, oh, this is amazing. This is, the first really huge award that I've won from the American science fiction community. And so that was, especially for that book, it was very moving for me, because that novel, Who Fears Death, was a lot. And then it was when my daughter's father came to visit, And I showed him, very proud. And I knew about Lovecraft. And at that point, I knew about Lovecraft. I knew of his issues. They just weren't in the forefront of my mind. You know, the forefront of my mind was, I won this award and I'm proud of it. It was when he came over and he saw the award, and he's a poet. And so he was like, he took one look, he's like, is that Lovecraft? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, let me show you something. And then he showed me that poem that Lovecraft had written with a very problematic word in the title about the creation of that problematic word. And it was when I saw, like when he showed that poem to me, where it just clicked in my mind. I was like, oh.
And that poem is just unbelievable.
It was unbelievable.
Horrible.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. It was jarring. It woke me up because I knew of those issues, but it wasn't in the forefront of my mind. So when I saw that poem, that was a moment where I remember thinking, oh, I'm gonna have to be the one. Like, it was in that moment, I'm like, I'm gonna have to be that Black person who brings this up, because this needs to be brought up.
Nnedi wrote a blog post about the Lovecraft statuette, prompting online debate, and ultimately, the World Fantasy Awards Board decided to change the award's design.
Let me close by pointing out, in August of 2017, you visited his grave, you posted it on Twitter, smiling face, saying you were paying your respects and he was probably rolling in his grave, but he'll be okay. And I think that says a lot about who you are. You faced so much adversity, you faced racism, you win this honor, which I think we've left out, that you kind of turned it backwards so you didn't have to stare at him, which was also kind of
put
comical.
Some shells on his necklace.
What does that say about you as a person, do you think? And what was the response on Twitter when you did that?
It was mainly positive. I didn't think there would be that much of a response. I was actually surprised about that. It was mainly positive. I've always come from the philosophy of, I don't like erasure. I like inclusion. You know, I like there to be more voices and not fewer voices. So I didn't want Lovecraft to be erased from, from a position of importance. I just feel like we need to look at everything, and we need more, just a diversity of voices. I think that's important. So that's always been my philosophy with these things. Visiting, I went on the tour. I went on the Lovecraft tour and everything. I want to know about him. It's interesting. But yeah, I'm just one I like inclusion. And that's really the point of view I've always come from with this.
It's a great attitude. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Really been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you.